You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I am Dustin and Tony is with me, and we are here to discuss everything from the week of October 7th through the 13th. We have some topics that we talked about last episode that we're going to get to this episode because while there is a bunch of news, there's not actually a bunch of stuff worth discussing. So we're going to get into the first bit of news with Netflix. Netflix has announced a new original Godzilla anime series. There is also an animated action series called Blue Eye Samurai that has been ordered by Netflix. Netflix has landed a deal to create multiple projects, including film, television, live action specials, all specifically revolving around Elf on the Shelf. Yes, that elf that sits on the shelf in some households during the holidays. Netflix has picked up the Iraq drama Mosul, and there is also a South by Southwest short called Selfie that Netflix has ordered a feature treatment for. Jumping over to Prime Video, there's a sci-fi series called The Cleaners that is currently in development. Over at Hulu, there is a WeWork documentary film that is actually going to be coming to Hulu. Now, interestingly, there is a ton of WeWork documentaries all over the place. There was one at one point, I believe, at Snapchat and at Quibi, and then there was one which Quibi would be perfect place for it because of what's happening with Quibi, but I digress. But I think there's also one set up at Amazon as well right now. Or Netflix. I can't remember exactly, but I remember there's a bunch of different people who are working on documentaries regarding WeWork and how it completely fell apart.
Yeah, WeWork is such a weird story. I mean, it was one of the unicorns, as they say, before it was going to go public. The IPO was going to look really good, but then there was more disclosures, financial disclosures, and people looked at the books more and realized like how messed up this company was, and you know, issues with the founder and basically the founder. It's like a whole crazy story, and so I would love to see this as a documentary, and so I'm really pumped that Hulu is going to bring the story to life. I mean, it's one of those companies like remember like Theranos was a health services company a while back. Then it got into regulatory trouble and then it went down the hill. And it was like this big story that blew up and it got very popular. And then now there's, I forget which, we covered it a few episodes ago, but there is going to be a documentary on the founder of Theranos. And so WeWork kind of reminds me of that story of like a darling unicorn. You know, us just really liked, really enjoyed, and then it just went down in flames. So, you know, as a fan of documentaries and as a fan of this type of stuff, this is going to be really cool.
All right. There is nothing for Paramount Plus / CBS All Access. Apple TV Plus, there is a documentary series that is called The Supermodels, featuring 4 of the top supermodels from the 1990s that has landed at Apple. Apple has also picked up the natural history series called Earth Sound. And if you are currently an Apple TV Plus subscriber because you bought a new Apple device last year, the end of October is actually the end of your free subscription trial for that first year. But Apple has announced that depending if you did purchase a new product, they are going to extend your membership for an additional 3 months to, as they put it, get you through the COVID winter. So you'll be able to use Apple TV Plus through, I believe, the end of January is when it'll end now.
Dustin, how much do you think that this is Apple feeling nice for, you know, its subscribers, for its users, and wanting to give people opportunity to watch maybe Mythic Quest or something? That's my shameless plug for the show Mythic Quest, which I love. But how much is it, you know, Apple's trying to be nice to us and that they really are still trying to hold on to subscribers and to not inflate their numbers, because I feel like that's always done with like negative intent, but trying to drum up support for their fledgling, you know, product?
I think it has very little at all to do with them trying to be nice. I don't think Apple has any desire to be nice in general. My take on this is that Apple is doing this specifically because they know that the number of subscribers for Apple TV Plus are going to drop is like super significantly over the next month and a half, however long that initial promotion was good for. And when that happens, there just won't be that, a sudden surge like there was before. Now, I know that there's a new Apple iPhone coming out, and maybe they're going to announce that they're going to have another, new promotion where if you buy the new iPhone, you get Apple TV Plus. I'm sure that's probably what they're going to do, because it could just keep people who consistently get the new device every single year on Apple TV Plus as a subscriber, even though they're not paying for it. Now, Apple, of course, doesn't view their service as, I wouldn't say it's not a priority, because obviously they're pumping a lot of money into it. They have a lot of TV series that they're creating right now that are coming in the future. But I think that, at least when it comes to like their quarterly earnings and stuff like that, they hardly ever talk about Apple TV Plus. And I think that's because they don't really have anything to really talk about, to brag about. They're not going to talk about how bad it's doing, because ultimately it's a tiny little sliver of their humongous business that they have. So for them, if they can offer new Apple customers this subscription for free, it keeps people tied into the Apple ecosystem, which is what they're obviously really geared towards right now. So I would say this is more for them to keep their numbers where they're at, and by announcing that, the membership is extending, maybe people who didn't even, who had forgotten for a while that they even have the subscription to Apple TV Plus, maybe they saw the announcement and were like, oh yeah, oh crap, it's ending at the end of the month. Now I've got an extra 3 months. Maybe I should actually check out some of those shows. I think it is a good marketing aspect to try to get some of those people who haven't been using Apple TV Plus recently to watch more of the content, or to take a look at some of the content for an additional amount of time before their subscription ends. Because other than that, I don't see any reason why this would exist other than a marketing issue, to try to drum up some more eyeballs to the service.
That makes sense. That's kind of my view about it too. It's the fact of they're really trying to save the streaming service, and try to promote it, give free promotion to inflate the numbers as much as they can. Because I really do feel like Apple TV Plus has not caught on with consumers. It just hasn't, something about the service hasn't resonated. And they've had some decent properties, and they've had some good films, but nothing that I feel is really latching people on or making them excited for the service. The Boys came out, and like the internet just kind of like blew up about The Boys and how much great that show is. Disney Plus had The Mandalorian and how much people really attached to that. And there really hasn't been something so viral from Apple that I feel like, as much as I love like Mythic Quest or trying to think of like different shows, just nothing seems to have caught on in a bigger way as some of these other streaming services. So it really does feel like Apple's just under the guise of, being nice, or the holidays that are coming up or something like that. It's the subtext of they're trying to hold onto whatever subscribers that they have so the numbers look better for investors and people like that.
I agree. I think the biggest problem is they just don't have a library to really draw a lot of people in and to keep people around. I'm not going to deny there's been plenty of shows that have actually released. The Morning Show, For All Mankind, Mythic Quest, because of your suggestion. There's lots of shows that I really want to watch. Those are all shows that I really do want to see at some point. I don't have the desire to drop even as low as $5 a month to watch all of these shows and then not have anything else. If I had absolutely nothing to watch in any of my other services, I would probably drop the $5 and then watch, 2 or 3 of maybe those series that I really want to see on Apple, but it wouldn't keep me around because there's just not enough content. And I know that will change. And I promise Apple will have a subscriber with me as soon as they have a significant amount of content on a consistent basis. And unfortunately right now, I know probably COVID has disrupted their initial flow just like it disrupted everybody else. But I know that there is an insane amount of content that they have planned. There's a lot of high profile producers that are currently with production deals over at Apple. There's a lot of stuff in place that will be coming down the pipeline, and I'm excited for what's coming, and I'm looking forward to becoming a subscriber, but I'm going to wait until there's that consistent flow of content every single month. All right, so Disney Plus, the High School Musical series, which debuted last year when Disney Plus first launched, it will have a holiday special that will launch obviously on Disney Plus in the coming months. Disney's Pixar Soul. Well, before I get to that, I'll go in chronological order. So there was a thing that popped up last week. There was an investor by the name of Daniel Loeb who insisted to Disney to ditch the shareholder dividends and use that money to fund streaming because streaming is the way of the future And Disney, of all the companies out there, should go all in on streaming and not focus on theatrical at all anymore. And the thing is, there was a lot of pushback from a lot of analysts who said, no, that's not really how that works. And I think the biggest thing is, obviously, Disney has a lot of films. They have a ton of films that have the potential to make a lot of money. Like the Marvel films, the Star Wars films, Disney animated films, Pixar films, they all make a significant amount of money. However, if you look at the streaming service, there's just not the ability to make as much money on the streaming service. Don't get me wrong. When you have a project that, like Hamilton, that costs $75 million for them to purchase, and you put that on the service, you can get a return on something that's that inexpensive. And that's not saying anything negative about Hamilton. It's just that's not, a $200 million project like Black Widow, or a $200 million project like some of the Star Wars films or anything like that. You have a problem because theatrical films, the big blockbuster films, they spend a lot of money on those films. And unless you have hundreds of millions of subscribers that are pumping in, on average $10 a month, depending on the service, you just can't make as much money on a film releasing on a service as you can. Netflix is they've kind of gone around and spent a lot of money on content, but a lot of what they're doing is that they're building a library too. Disney already has a library. You look at Netflix, a lot of their original films, their big budget original films, they don't even go over $50 to $60 million. There's very few films that they have that cost more money than that. The films that they go out and they purchase typically are under $50 million. And I think because there's a specific number in place, now that's not to say there isn't. Obviously, The Irishman reportedly cost between $250 to $300 million when everything was said and done, which obviously was an insane amount of money, but they don't typically do that. They are typically in the range of $50 million or under if they're acquiring a film, or, in that $50 million to maybe $75 million for a bigger budget film. But they don't release an insane amount of those films either. So they can do that. But when you take a film like Black Widow, which is the example that keeps coming up because it was supposed to release back in May, it didn't. I think that film had a budget of maybe $120 to $150 million. That's a lot of money to just drop it on the service. Mulan cost upwards of $200 million, and they ended up going paid video on demand for that film, and it didn't, well, they're not going to say whether or not, we'll find out when they do their quarterly earnings report. The film didn't perform as well as everyone probably, or as they expected it to, specifically because they ended up shifting the release to a lot of different avenues. They just last weekend dropped Mulan on a lot of the other paid video on demand services outside of Disney Plus. You don't even have to have the Disney Plus subscription anymore. So there's changes that are happening. So while I'm not going to sit here and say, as an analyst, as what we do, looking at all of the stuff that we do, streaming is the wave of the future, but the services have to get much, much larger in order to maintain those humongous big budget projects to be on the services alone. And I think it's going to happen. Disney is probably one of the services that can get to that level very quickly and at a much faster rate than Netflix did. Netflix is sitting at, I think, 190 million subscribers worldwide, but they're going to have the growth rate. It's not going to keep growing. Disney Plus has the ability to probably get into maybe 200 million homes within the next couple of years, which will be half as much time as Netflix. Obviously, it took Netflix to get into that many households. And then maybe then their price goes up to $10. If you had 200 million subscribers and you're bringing in $10 for every single customer, that's a lot of money coming in every single month from your customer base, on top of all the other content that you're producing as well. So there's a lot of pushback from a lot of the analysts about going all in on streaming. I think the biggest thing is when it comes specifically to the big budget films, you just can't go all in on streaming. Now, that's not to say the mid-budget films that they have, they can easily move those over. The lower budget films should automatically be on streaming, in my opinion, because there's no reason they need to be anywhere but streaming at this point. But I'm all in on the idea of going all in on streaming. It's just, I think that it's going to take just a little bit more.
I mean, I agree with your premise and your points. I like the idea. I like the investor pointing out that, hey, why don't we, forego the quarterly dividend and we invest that into the company again? I feel like during this time of COVID-19 and the pandemic and just how everything is hitting Disney, the United States, and then, Disney is based in the United States. A significant chunk of the revenue is from the United States. It's important to reinvest in your business. And I like that idea of that instead of taking taking cash out, let's put cash back into the business and move from there. However, I like the investor's point of view of the fact of like, hey, let's why don't you just focus on streaming? Like, you could have just said, hey, let's invest this back into the company. I mean, there's many areas of Disney that are hurting right now. The parks that you were just there, merchandise sales have been lower due to lack of, free cash from people. So they're going to stop buying, just extra, anything non-essential. There's been a lack of merchandise revenue. Streaming has been the only thing that's consistent. So you could have just said, hey, invest in Disney proper, but hey, invest into the streaming services. I feel like that's a wise move of realizing, okay, look at your portfolio of the company. Look at the short term of, yes, there is a pandemic, but then the long term of, we will eventually at some point recover to things going back to a quote unquote normal, right? So how are we going to set ourselves up for the future, right? Obviously, the parks revenue is going to go up in the future. Obviously, merchandise is going to go back up. There's going to be some semblance of theaters and big budget movies going to be back to, well, more than they are. I don't think it's going to ever be back to normal because there was already a decline beforehand, but it's going to go back up. And so invest in the product that's like carrying you right now. And that is streaming. So that could be infrastructure, that could be investing in people, in content. However, I am a little bit concerned because if you invest only in streaming, I mean, it takes a long time for especially content to be produced. Like we made complaints multiple times that Disney doesn't have enough content kind of for adults. And if that is the case, and you want to invest more like quote unquote adult content, that takes time. That's going to take more than like the next quarter, like to create shows, to create content, good content. So it just depends on how they invest, this money. They invest the dividend is kind of how I drive this decision of investing back into streaming. Like, it could be good, it could be bad, it could just kind of be pointless. Like, I'm kind of like in the fence of, I do agree with his main point, but I do agree overall that yes, like Disney shouldn't abandon movies, but they just need to change. They just don't need to rely on that as their main source of revenue as much anymore. Because like with movies, it's the bigger the risk, right? That you put up 200 million, there's a potential return of, 1 billion, 1.5 billion. I mean, heck, in game made 2.5 billion, right? Almost 3 billion, or maybe you did hit 3 billion. I can't remember, but it was like a crazy amount. So like, yes, the bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. But given how theaters are, given the landscape of things, given how it's going to be a long time for people to feel comfortable going to a theater and just sitting, next to strangers as they sit for 2.5 hours in a, kind of semi-clean room that's you're sharing the same air with somebody. Like, it's going to take a while for the public to have a general trust of just indoor spaces again. Yes, they should invest in those movies as another form of revenue, but this shouldn't be the only way they make money. And I think streaming is the best way that they can have a steady cash flow during this time, right? Because Disney's not just one business. It's essentially 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 businesses that all kind of work together. And so investing in streaming is going to give them a steady cash flow during these times where then they can pump out these movies and it's, like, hey, here's this nice paycheck, here's this nice paycheck, but you still have that steady revenue plus this potential high profit revenue over here. I just did hand motions that don't really make well on podcasts, but that's kind of what they have to do. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you see this, I think, like, you want to compare it to something that maybe people have a better understanding with, like lawyers. Like, there's sometimes some lawyers get paid by just a monthly retainer, but then there's also some lawyers that get paid if they win a case. So, right, if you win a high profile case, you might get a pretty big paycheck, but if you lose the case, you might not get paid. But if you work on retainer, that means you get a steady paycheck every month or whatever the payment schedule is, but it's just more mellow. So that's kind of what Disney has to do. And that's just, good business of like de-risking yourself of just the movie market. And it might be a good humbling experience for Disney as a whole of that maybe they have over relied on Marvel and, Disney Animation Pixar to pump these hits out to inflate the profit line, the profit revenue. And then, when you have something as big of a stressor as COVID-19, it kind of really puts the health of the business in perspective of like, maybe we over-risked ourselves into the movies. So, because we know in the last few years, like how impressive Marvel Studios has been as just, maybe not all the movies have been that great, but they've been financially successful. I mean, Frozen, financially successful properties. I mean, just, Star Wars, so much controversy there from fandoms, but man, it still made a whole lot of money. And it might just been that Disney was over-reliant in that area, so they need to take a step back. But I definitely walk the middle line of like, yes, they do need to invest in big budget movies, but they also need to realize that like that's not the new normal. That's like the old way of how people consume media is changed to streaming, and you need to invest in streaming.
Now, what's amusing is despite all the pushback from the analysts, interestingly, within days after the investor pushing Disney to do these things focused on streaming, it was announced that Soul, which is Disney Pixar's next film that was planned for release right around Thanksgiving, is actually now being released on Christmas Day on Disney Plus exclusively for free. It's not going to be a paid video on demand situation. It's going to release. And that was a big budget film. That'll be actually the first major big budget film that Disney has released directly to the service. Onward, they did release early, but it did land in theaters a couple weeks before COVID and ended up on Disney Plus. But this will be the first major film that Disney had on their release schedule that will actually be heading to streaming exclusively. Now, there was some massive backlash from the European theatrical market because obviously in certain countries in Europe, they're not experiencing the same situations that here in the US is with COVID, where they don't have as many restrictions. Theaters have reopened, and things are, in a better situation than some of the specific markets that are here in the U.S. Obviously, markets in New York and California are still closed when it comes to the theaters, those are huge markets for the theaters. But in addition to that, over in Europe, the theaters have reopened. So having a massive film like Soul not release, in theaters is a huge hit to the theatrical market, which is the same problem that we've seen multiple times with, we've seen it with Universal. That was a huge deal. Nobody else has really made as big of a deal about films releasing, but Universal was the first one with the Trolls film, and now Disney's doing it with this film, which would have obviously most likely done way more money than the Trolls film, which for theaters, they're losing out a lot of money, and that's the problem. Now, to further then take this step further, just this week, they announced that they're creating a new corporate structure that divides all its content business into three groups that are responsible and accountable for producing and delivering content for theatrical, linear, and streaming, with the primary focus to the company's streaming services. Now, timing-wise, this couldn't have come at any better time when it comes to the investor making the comment about how streaming has to be the focus. And now, of course, this new corporate restructure happens, and that's happening as well. So, interesting timing, but they're clearly realizing that maybe if anybody can do it, it's them. Disney's the one company that can probably do this with the streaming service because of the incredible growth that they've had in just under a year since they've released. All right, so jumping over to Quibi. Quibi has a new series that is going to create the largest oceanic feeding frenzy. They're going to drop a 10-ton ball of chum into the ocean and see what happens. Sounds like a YouTube video to me.
Wow, that doesn't sound interesting at all.
All right, HBO Max. Aaron Guzikowski has inked an overall deal. He is the creator behind Raised by Wolves, which is the series that just recently debuted on HBO Max. HBO Max is developing a series based around the launch of Essence magazine. There is a Batman-themed preschool series called Bat Wheels, which will be coming to HBO Max. HBO Max is circling an animated Lumberjanes series. Lumberjanes is a comic book series from Boom Comics by Noelle Stevenson, who is probably even better known for heading up the She-Ra animated series over at Netflix that was very successful. There is a Sesame Street special that will tackle racism that is coming to HBO Max. HBO Max has picked up the British series from the Succession writer I Hate Susie. HBO Max has ordered a pilot for the psychological thriller series called Red Bird Lane. The Green Lantern series gets a full order. Now, I'm putting this in here because for some reason it kept popping up. But the Green Lantern series, everybody knew about last October. They announced they were doing a Green Lantern series back at the investor meeting last October with the large slate of the other shows that were coming on the series. But for some reason, it was a big deal when they announced the showrunner for the series, and everybody kept saying, instead of there's a showrunner attached, there's writer attached to the series. Instead of focusing on that, everyone just kept saying there was a new Green Lantern series that's coming to HBO Max, which was, like I said, announced last year, so it's not new news. Anyway, John Wells, who is best known for creating shows like Shameless, among a number of other series, he is developing two series for HBO Max. There's a lifeguard drama, and then there's a series that is similar to things that make white people uncomfortable. And then there is a series called The Valley of Tears, which is the most expensive series coming out of Israel of all time. HBO Max has landed the global rights to that series as well. We have no news for Peacock. There is no news for any niche streaming services. Other streaming providers, a couple of different things. Tubi is going to beginning to offer on-demand news from Fox. Specifically, as those of you who are unaware, Fox actually owns Tubi, not to be confused with 20th Century Fox, which Disney owns, the Fox News Group, and the other elements that Disney didn't purchase. They purchased Tubi, but now Fox will be offering news on their service, which is Tubi. Pluto TV is going to be launching in Spain, and there are plans for the expansion in Italy and France within 2021. The Roku channel is landing on Amazon devices, which I have to say is one of the most interesting things that came out of the news this week, because Amazon and Roku typically are, competitors. But when it comes to streaming, getting a distribution deal with the Roku channel or landing the Roku channel on Amazon is a big deal for Roku, because that allows them to have their content being viewed on, another 20 to 25% of the market share of devices that are out there. They already have between 40 and 45 of the market share of streaming devices covered, but that is the only people who are watching the Roku channel at this point. Now you can actually download the Roku channel as a separate app on other devices as well as your Amazon devices as well, which is a pretty big deal for Roku. Obviously, Amazon Prime Video is available, as well as the other implements within Amazon. They're available on Roku, so I'm sure it's probably like we're letting you have your service on ours, you let us have our service on yours kind of situation. And then finally, in another very strange announcement, Pluto TV has landed the free streaming rights to Narcos, a Netflix original series. Now, those of you who are wondering how in the world did this happen, well, it turns out this deal was made outside of specifically Netflix. It was made with the production company, but because it is ad supported, that's how this is coming to be. And I'm sure Netflix is getting a little piece of something of this deal, but the biggest thing is I think that this is something where Netflix could probably do this a little bit more, especially with series that have wrapped and are no longer producing new seasons, where they're not going to be there's no way for them to be deciding whether or not to renew shows or not. It's the same thing that all the broadcast channels have been doing for years. The distributors, I should say, not the broadcast channels. Shows appear on a broadcast channel, they're widely successful, and then syndication rights go off to the cable channels, and obviously with streaming services as well. That's what's probably going to happen with a lot of these Netflix originals in the future, just because there's a lot of deals that are only in place for a certain amount of time. Eventually, House of Cards, which was Netflix's first series, the rights will expire and the rights will revert back to Sony, and then Sony could technically sell the very first Netflix original to another service or to broadcast television or cable television.
Just, I feel like a lot of these announcements were kind of shocking, but this one was the most interesting of how Narcos was able to, get itself on Pluto TV. I find that very interesting. It could just be because you mentioned House of Cards and there's Narcos. There's a certain time where Netflix itself didn't create content. Like it helped fund content, but it didn't have like production studios itself to actually create this content itself. And, reading up on Narcos, it was produced in conjunction with another partner. So I can see for like what you said, like House of Cards, Narcos, other shows like this, where, once the rights last, you could see, these other production companies, these other partners make deals with other companies about maybe, AVOD or something like that. So that is very interesting, but I don't see that this is going to become a new trend for Netflix in terms of like the content that they created like in-house, like maybe like Witcher or something, like let's just say The Witcher ends or Stranger Things ends or something like that. I don't see after like 5 years or something a situation where they're going to license out their content to another player in the space, even if it is Pluto TV, which isn't a direct rival to Netflix. I just don't really see that happening. So this is like a very unique, I think, like one-off case.
With that is going to bring us into our discussion points. And while I said we were going to talk about COVID effects on streaming, I think we're going to hold that because there was a new thing that popped up that I want to get to as well. The first one, the first one that I will talk about, which I mentioned on the last episode, is WarnerMedia has landed the MLB rights, an MLB rights package for the next 7 years. And one of the things that is listed within the actual announcement is that it will allow MLB games to be broadcast on additional WarnerMedia platforms. It doesn't specifically say HBO Max, and it doesn't say anywhere else, but you would assume that it could potentially mean HBO Max. Now, why I wanted to specifically talk about this is that we know that like CBS All Access, which will then eventually be rebranded into Paramount Plus, they already have deals in place where they have certain sports. Peacock has certain sports. Amazon has currently got the Thursday Night Football access as well on Prime Video. There's different sports rights, and we've talked about sports rights all over the place on this show. But I want to go back to it because I think that HBO Max, the one thing that we really haven't talked about is HBO Max's potential with sports. And they have deals in place with not just MLB, but they also have things in place for, like, let's say March Madness, where not only do they have rights, but TBS, TNT, and True TV all play different games from March Madness, which I would assume if the deals are in place, that would mean that NCAA basketball could end up on HBO Max in the future too, when they eventually roll out that new version of what they were talking about with live news and live sports and things like that. The question, and on top of that, I should point this out, while this isn't necessarily live sports, TNT is currently airing a new wrestling organization called AEW, which is probably the second largest wrestling organization within the United States outside of the WWE, which does their own stuff and they have broadcasts on Fox and USA, which is owned by NBC Universal. But AEW airs exclusively on TNT. They have a show. They are successful enough where earlier this year they announced that they were going to have an additional hour of primetime television dedicated to the wrestling league. So they have wrestling, baseball, basketball, or college basketball. The question is there any other sports, because I know you're a sports person, is there any other sports out there that you think that could end up on HBO Max or that WarnerMedia would make a play for in the future? Because obviously with AT&T and DirecTV, there's the NFL Sunday Ticket. We've talked about that. We don't think that they're going to renew that, and eventually DirecTV is going to get sold off, so it's not going to make a difference. But do you think there's anything else out there that they can make a play for?
If you look at the United States, there's obviously football, basketball, which are huge. Then you have baseball and hockey, which are like, you have the top two of like football, basketball, and then you have like baseball, hockey as number two in the United States. If you look at globally in the world, I mean, soccer is definitely, huge, and you have hockey, which is also huge. I feel like I'm trying to think of like other sports that are just like huge revenue generating. Like they can definitely add more. Overall, I think this is a good move for HBO Max, is that you're moving into, different areas of not just streaming by itself, but classic streaming content. I'm trying to think like House of Cards, Mandalorian, stuff like that. But in terms of sports, because sports are huge, and sports, you can, get people to watch that on mobile. You can watch that kind of wherever, and people will enjoy that. And there's lots of ad revenue right there because lots of advertisers spend a lot of money on that. So that's pretty huge. And so this deal, this gaining the MLB rights package, that's substantial, and that's pretty huge. And it's great.
NBA, which I didn't even think about, is also airing on TNT occasionally as well. So there could be NBA games that pop up on HBO Max in the future as well. I think the long side of this idea is that HBO Max has the potential to have a lot of different content. Obviously, when you look at services like Peacock, they have golf and they have tennis because NBC Sports has been playing that stuff for a while. They also have specific rights, not Peacock specifically, but NBC Universal through NBC Sports, which formerly was Comcast Sports. They have specific regional rights as well to certain games as well. But I don't think that'll end up on Peacock. However, I know golf is a big deal for them. Obviously, the Olympics are a huge deal for them. And then there's tennis that pops up there too. When I'm thinking about other things out there, I know NASCAR can be pretty big, but I personally don't know where NASCAR regularly airs. I think it's on Fox, but it could be on a variety of different stations, just like the NFL is on a variety of different stations. But I think the thing is, if WarnerMedia really wants to go into making sure that they have a huge sports area, they need to have sports every season. They can't just have baseball in the summer and the early fall. They can't have just basketball in the winter. They need to have other things during those other times of the year as well. So I think it's important for any of the services who are really thinking about growing significant. I'm looking specifically at Peacock, CBS All Access, HBO Max, because of how they're already structured with their parent companies. I think those are the ones that make the most sense to really try to go after sports because they already have that connection.
Yeah, I think what they can improve on is like those three three are really huge. So I like football. I like the NFL. And there's an issue where due to the market that I live in, I can only get certain games on Fox or CBS. And then the one on ABC is just global. So there's only certain games that air in my region. And I would really like if maybe HBO Max and these streaming services in general, if we're going to generalize a little bit, went beyond of just like, okay, here's your market. And like, here is the game that you can watch. Like if they can show like all the games that are airing on CBS that day or all the games that are airing on Fox that day, right? All these different places, that would be nice. Like expanding these deals to show more content, right? So streaming is the way is allowing more people to watch your content than like the NFL, like HBO Max should get with the NFL, and like, hey, let's hash out these agreements to even be even more, so that you're not dealing with the local blackouts that happen and stuff like that. Like I'm so tired of watching the Falcons because they suck. And I'll say that on the record. Hopefully they get better, but it's just, I think that would be huge of like just more diverse games. I think that I love the idea of like these streaming players trying to like one up each other and take a dominant position in the space, but maybe all they just need to do is just open it up more and like opening up sports more. And I think that even if they just did that, that would be substantial to their bottom line, to subscribers, to a whole bunch of different things of like, hey, you can get any game that was played on, this so-and-so network, and then you can get that and go. Like you can get a certain subset of games. You can get the NFC or just the AFC on HBO Max. Like maybe there's a weird deal there or something like that. That would be huge because there's a lot of games that just aren't televised, that aren't played. I mean, like the NBA playoffs. I mean, they played pretty much like 4 or 5 games certain days at the very beginning of the NBA bubble, but there's still games that were not aired on ESPN or TNT that I feel like streaming service would be the perfect place for. Like maybe it's not like the prime time game, but it could be just players. It could be games that are substantial that could find an audience and that you can get a foothold as well. So like there's still a lot of opportunities within sports, and you don't just have to get maybe the rights to all of the NFL or something like that, but like you can definitely change the game and change up the streaming model of how sports are streamed. And hopefully streaming services will start to do that more. I mean, the MLB, there's tons of games that don't get aired unless you're like the Yankees or maybe the Dodgers or like a big name team. Like if you're not one of those, then there's a good chance that you might not have a lot of nationally televised games where you can maybe leverage a deal with a streaming service to then have your games aired, and you would be able to be seen by, some percentage more than you would have been if not aired, except in the local market. You know what I mean? There's still a lot of room there, and I feel like maybe people haven't explored that, and that's something I would like to see is streaming be more impactful in sports instead of just like the deals that there are now. I think there's still a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the biggest hurdle with sports is the regional blackout areas, because it just comes down to those that worked perfectly before the dawn of the internet. But now everything is so global. I can live in Chicago and be a fan of a team in California or New York or Florida. It doesn't matter where the team is. I can be a fan of anywhere. But if I can't watch those games without having to subscribe to, let's say, NFL Sunday Ticket with football and be able to watch, have the ability to watch 12 games when in reality I'm just looking for that one specific game, it's not worth it. It's not worth, especially because NFL Sunday Ticket is so expensive. It's not cheap at all. So I think the biggest thing is they need to get into some sort of model of, when it comes to CBS and NBC, they already have obviously streaming services, and they already have deals in place with the NFL. Fox has a deal in place with the NFL as well. I think CBS and NBC are primed to have a position where they are able to air multiple games, and you can go onto Peacock and just go onto the channel, like even the live channels that have the ads, and watch those games. And just depending on which region you're in, you watch the specific region that the game is in, so that you can see the game that you want that they're currently airing. When it comes to other sports, especially MLB, because there's so many teams and there are so many games that they play, and this goes with NBA as well, but I think the biggest thing is they just need to make it so that if you want to watch a game, you can watch a game. You don't have to try to figure out some way of getting a VPN server to mask where your IP address is just so that you can log in so you can see a game that is not in your broadcast area. It's ridiculous. They need to fix that, and it has to come from the leagues themselves, not necessarily the streaming services that are potentially airing them, because because the leagues have to acknowledge that change is here. This is something that needs to happen, and this is going to only allow them to get to more eyeballs. So there's that. All right, the last discussion point isn't really a discussion. It's more of an article I wanted everyone to check out. If you regularly read our show notes and you check out the stuff that we offer, you'll know that sometimes I come across articles that I think are worth a read. There's an article that popped up on Vulture talking about Netflix show cancellations. There's a couple of shows which we'll get to hopefully next week. I keep pushing this off, but the COVID effects on streaming. There's a couple of shows that COVID has that were renewed that have been canceled even though they were already renewed. I don't know what the word, how you would word that, but the idea is that they're not going to continue on even though they were renewed because of COVID concerns and things like that. There was some concerns because there's 2 series that Netflix had renewed that they then canceled. It brought up a big discussion point about how Netflix doesn't have very many series that are lasting past 2 or 3 seasons at this point, and how it's becoming almost a common occurrence. In the very beginning, shows were averaging about 5 seasons for some of their originals. Now there's a lot more series, and the larger number of series and the lower season count is making people question whether or not Netflix is even giving some of these shows the opportunity to build an audience at all, because when you compare it to broadcast has shows that can be super successful and last 10 seasons, and that just doesn't really happen on streaming at this point. So I would suggest taking a look at it. I thought it was a good read. I just wanted to throw it out there for people to take a look at, but not really worth a discussion because Netflix is canceling stuff all the time because they watch and they have their own math that they do to figure out exactly whether or not something is successful or not. So with all of that being said, we're going to push the COVID effects on streaming to next week. I hopefully based on the amount of news that has been coming in, I imagine we should be able to get to that without any additional secondary discussions. There is a number of trailers that have released, not as many as the last episode, but there is still a lot of trailers that have released. There's a lot of content that is currently releasing as well. With all that being said, I strongly suggest that you check out the show notes. They are available at our website, thestreamingwars.io, where you can check out all the articles that we talked about here, links to the trailers that have released over the past week as well. You can follow us on Twitter and join our Discord to check out all the articles as we find them. They post on a regular, consistent basis on Discord and on our Twitter. If you follow us on Instagram, you will be able to find announcements related to new episodes of the podcast releasing. That's what we utilize Instagram for. I did get an email recently asking if we had a Facebook presence, and part of the reason we don't have a Facebook presence is outside of it's the exact same thing that we do on the other platforms. It just reposting stuff nothing really happens with stuff that you're just reposting like we do with the articles that we have. So that's part of the reason we did. I've only ever gotten 2 questions about Facebook, so that's one of the reasons that we don't, for those of you who have ever wondered why we're not on Facebook. With that being said, you can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns. Feedback is always greatly appreciated wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you can leave feedback or leave us a review, that is always greatly appreciated as well. And with all that being said, for Tony and myself, please continue to stay safe out there, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.